September 13, 1959, Germany. Elvis Presley had everything a young man could dream of. Fame, money, millions of fans, a voice recognized around the world, and a name that could make an entire room erupt. But that night, none of it mattered, because Elvis Presley wasn't standing beneath concert lights. He wasn't holding a microphone. He wasn't surrounded by screaming fans. He was in Germany, far from home, far from the stage, and still carrying the pain of losing the woman who had meant more to him than almost anyone else. His mother, Gladys, had died only a little more than a year earlier. Now Elvis was serving in the United States Army. The king of rock and roll had become a soldier. And on this particular night, through a mutual friend, a 14-year-old girl named Priscilla Beaulieu was invited to Elvis's home. She had no idea what was waiting for her behind that door. She didn't know that the man she had seen in magazines would soon be sitting across from her. She didn't know that the conversation they were about to have would eventually lead to marriage. She didn't know that years later she would become Mrs. Elvis Presley. She didn't know that she would become the mother of his only child. And most importantly, she didn't know that the man everyone else saw as a superstar was about to show her a completely different side of himself. Because when Priscilla walked into that room, she wasn't walking into history. She thought she was simply walking into a party. And that is what makes what happened next so extraordinary. At the time, Elvis was 24. To the world, he was almost untouchable. Only a few years earlier, he had exploded onto the American music scene and become one of the biggest stars in entertainment. His name was everywhere. His records were everywhere. His image was everywhere. But Germany had placed him in a strange new reality. Instead of concerts, there were military duties. Instead of fans screaming from the front row, there were soldiers. Instead of the familiar streets of Memphis, there were German roads, military bases, and a life far away from everything he knew. Elvis had arrived in Germany in October of 1958 and was stationed in the Friedberg area, maintaining a home in Bad Nauheim with family and friends. Even there, his fame followed him. But fame couldn't follow him into every moment. There were evenings when the noise disappeared. There were moments when the superstar became simply Elvis, a young man, a son who had lost his mother, a soldier far from America, a man whose career had been temporarily put on hold. And perhaps that is why the evening of September 13th would matter so much. Because Elvis wasn't looking for another screaming fan. He already had millions of those. He was sitting in a room where, for once, he could simply talk. Then Priscilla arrived. She was 14. Her family had only recently arrived in Germany after her stepfather, Captain Joseph Beaulieu, was transferred there. Graceland's official timeline records that Priscilla was invited to the party through a mutual friend soon after her arrival. She knew exactly who Elvis was. But knowing someone's name and meeting the person behind the name are two completely different things. Imagine the scene. A room filled with conversation. People moving around. Music in the background. And then Elvis notices the young girl, Priscilla. She wasn't walking into the room as a celebrity. She wasn't dressed like someone trying to capture attention. She was simply there. And Elvis began talking to her. At first, it was ordinary. A few questions. A few answers. A little conversation. Nothing that would make history books stop and take notice. But something about the encounter made Elvis continue. The conversation didn't end after a few polite sentences. It kept going. And going. The famous singer began asking questions. Priscilla answered. Then she listened. Then Elvis talked some more. And slowly the atmosphere changed. The rest of the room seemed less important. The superstar wasn't performing. He was talking. And Priscilla wasn't watching a performance. She was meeting a person. That difference would become one of the defining elements of their relationship. Because the public knew Elvis as Elvis Presley. But that night, Priscilla was beginning to encounter the man behind the name. There was something almost ironic about it. Elvis had spent years trying to make the world look at him. Now, in a quiet room in Germany, he seemed interested in someone who simply listened. She didn't need a concert. She didn't need a record. She didn't need a stage. She didn't need thousands of people around her. She was simply having a conversation. And Elvis kept talking. They discussed music. They discussed family. They discussed life. The subjects were ordinary. But the situation wasn't. Because one person in that conversation was already a global icon. And the other was a 14-year-old girl who had only recently arrived in Germany. Neither could possibly understand what that night would eventually become. According to Graceland's own historical timeline, the two became fast friends after meeting that September evening. But friendship was only the beginning. The real story was still waiting. For Priscilla, there was another surprise. The Elvis in front of her was not exactly the Elvis she had seen in photographs. The public image was larger than life. The famous hair, the famous clothes, the famous voice, the stage presence, the screaming crowds. But sitting in that room was a much quieter person. A person who could listen. A person who could talk about things beyond music. A person who had experienced loss. A person who was living thousands of miles away from home. And perhaps most importantly, a person who didn't have to perform every second. That was the Elvis Priscilla was beginning to see. Not the king. Not the movie star. Not the record-breaking singer. The man. And that distinction would follow their relationship for years. But there was a problem. A very big problem. Priscilla was 14. Elvis was 24. He was a famous adult serving overseas in the army. She was the teenage daughter of a military family. And soon, the adults around them would have to confront a question that nobody could simply ignore. Why did Elvis want to keep seeing her? That question would become unavoidable. Because this wasn't going to be a single meeting. The conversation that began that night would continue. The friendship would deepen. And Elvis would begin asking to see Priscilla again. But every additional meeting meant another question. And every question brought her parents closer to a decision. Would they allow this relationship to continue? Would they trust Elvis? Could they trust the situation? And what would happen when Elvis's military service ended? Because everyone knew one thing. Elvis wasn't going to remain in Germany forever. For the moment, however, none of that had happened. The night was still young. The future was still invisible. And inside that house, Elvis and Priscilla were simply talking. Two people from completely different worlds. One was already famous around the planet. The other was still a schoolgirl. One had millions of fans waiting for him in America. The other had only recently arrived in Germany. And yet somehow, they found themselves talking. That's what makes the beginning of this story so powerful. It wasn't a grand romantic scene. It wasn't a Hollywood movie. It wasn't a dramatic declaration. It was much smaller, much quieter, almost invisible. A conversation. And sometimes, A conversation is all it takes to change a life. Eventually, the evening had to end. Priscilla would go home. Elvis would remain in Germany. The house would become quiet again. The people would leave. The music would stop. And another night would begin. From the outside, nothing extraordinary had happened. A famous soldier had met a young girl. They had talked. That was all. But Elvis remembered her. And Priscilla remembered him. That mattered. Because if the story had ended there would be no marriage. No Graceland years together. No Lisa Marie. No decades of public fascination with their relationship. There would simply be one forgotten evening in Germany. But the story didn't end. It had barely started. In the weeks that followed, the connection continued. And that is where the story becomes more complicated. Because the first meeting had been unexpected. The second meeting was a choice. The third was another choice. And with every meeting, the relationship became harder to dismiss as a passing encounter. Elvis wanted to see Priscilla. Priscilla wanted to see Elvis. But there was an enormous obstacle standing between them. Time. Elvis's army service was moving toward its end. And when that day arrived, he would return to America. The crowds would return. The cameras would return. Hollywood would return. Music would return. His old life would return. And Priscilla would be left thousands of miles away. Germany on one side, America on the other. And between them, an ocean. But Elvis had no idea yet how important that distance would become. Because before he could return home, before the last day in Germany, before the final goodbye, the relationship would have to survive something even more difficult. Her parents, they were about to realize that their 14-year-old daughter was spending time with one of the most famous men in the world. And they weren't simply going to stand back and watch. Questions were coming. Rules were coming. Doubt was coming. And Elvis would have to prove that this wasn't just another passing fascination. Because Priscilla's parents had something Elvis's fame could not buy. Their trust. And if he couldn't earn it, this story could end before it ever truly began. But Elvis wasn't ready to let that happen. Not yet. Because somewhere during that first conversation, something had changed. The king of rock and roll had met a girl who didn't seem interested in the king. She had simply talked to Elvis. And perhaps that was precisely why he couldn't forget her. The world already knew the superstar. But that night in Germany, Priscilla had met the man. And the man wanted to see her again. What neither of them knew was that their next chapter would take them far beyond that quiet room. Beyond Germany. Beyond the army. Beyond the Atlantic. And eventually, all the way to Graceland. But first, Elvis had to leave Germany. And when that day finally came, he would discover whether the connection that began with one quiet conversation could survive thousands of miles of separation. Because meeting Elvis Presley was only the beginning. The real test was whether they could keep each other after he went home. And for the first time, the question that neither of them had wanted to ask became impossible to avoid. What happens when the man you've grown attached to disappears across an ocean? Because the night they met had been easy. The conversations had been easy. Even the growing connection had seemed almost effortless. But now reality was arriving. Elvis Presley had an army career to finish. America was calling him home. And Priscilla was staying behind. The room where their story had begun would soon become a memory. The German streets they had walked through would become memories. The evenings together would become memories. And soon, the only thing they would have left was distance. But neither of them was ready to let the story end. By the time Elvis's return to America approached, Priscilla already understood that she had become emotionally attached to him. This wasn't simply the excitement of meeting a famous singer anymore. She had seen the quieter side of Elvis. She had listened to him talk about his life. She had spent time with him away from the cameras. And the more she saw him, the less important his fame seemed. She wasn't falling for a photograph. She was becoming attached to the person behind it. That distinction mattered, because when Elvis eventually returned to America, he would step back into a world that treated him like a superstar. Priscilla couldn't compete with that world. She couldn't follow him everywhere. She couldn't stand beside him on every red carpet. She couldn't control the thousands of women who adored him. All she could do was wait and hope. Then came March 1960. Elvis's military service in Germany was ending. The moment everyone had known was coming had finally arrived. He was going home. On March 5th, Elvis left active military service at Fort Dix after completing his service, and the world immediately began watching what the returning superstar would do next. But for Priscilla, the story was much more personal. This wasn't simply the end of a military chapter. It was the beginning of separation. Think about the contrast. Elvis was about to return to America and walk straight back into fame. Priscilla was going back to her ordinary teenage life in Germany. For him, millions of people would be waiting. For her, one person was leaving. And that one person mattered. When Elvis returned to America, the world welcomed him like a king coming home. The cameras were everywhere. Reporters wanted interviews. Fans wanted photographs. The music industry wanted him back. Hollywood wanted him back. The machine surrounding Elvis Presley started moving again. And Elvis stepped right back into it. But something had changed. There was now someone in Germany he didn't want to lose. Priscilla. And that meant the relationship would have to survive without the thing that had made it possible in the first place. Physical closeness. They could no longer sit in the same room. They could no longer talk late into the evening. They could no longer see each other whenever they wanted. Now there would be an ocean between them. And an ocean is a very different kind of obstacle. For Priscilla, the days must have felt painfully different. Before she knew where Elvis was, she could see him. She could talk to him. Now she had to imagine what his life looked like thousands of miles away. She knew the world wanted him. She knew Hollywood wanted him. She knew women wanted him. And she knew that Elvis's life was about to become more chaotic than ever. That uncertainty could have destroyed the relationship. But instead, they stayed in contact. Letters, phone calls, messages passed across the Atlantic. The relationship continued. And slowly something became clear. The connection had not depended entirely on being in the same room. It had begun with conversation. Now conversation was the thing keeping it alive. Elvis's return to America also brought back everything that had been waiting for him. The music, the films, the public appearances, the endless attention. He was no longer the soldier in Germany. He was Elvis Presley again. The superstar, the movie star, the cultural phenomenon. But there was another side to that comeback. The world expected Elvis to be exactly what he had always been. Young, powerful, confident, unstoppable. Few people understood how much had changed inside him. His mother's death still affected him deeply. His years in Germany had changed him. And now he had someone in his life who reminded him of a quieter period when he wasn't constantly surrounded by cameras. Priscilla represented something different, something private, something that existed outside the machinery of fame. And that may have been one reason the relationship continued to matter. But distance creates doubt, and doubt creates questions. What was Elvis doing? Who was he with? Would he forget her? Would Hollywood change him? Would another woman become more important? Would the promise of the relationship survive? For Priscilla, these weren't abstract questions. She was young. She was far away. And Elvis's world was enormous. Every newspaper photograph could remind her that she was competing with a world that had millions of people in it. Yet Elvis continued to communicate with her. And that mattered. He didn't simply disappear after returning home. He kept the connection alive. Then something even more important happened. Elvis began talking seriously about the future. Not immediately. Not all at once. But the idea of Priscilla becoming part of his life in America slowly became more real. And that meant another difficult conversation. Her parents, they had watched the relationship from the beginning. They knew Elvis was famous. They knew he was older. They knew their daughter was becoming emotionally attached to him. And now Elvis was thousands of miles away. If he wanted this relationship to continue, he would have to earn their confidence. This wasn't going to be solved by sending a few romantic messages. Elvis would have to demonstrate that he was serious, that he respected their concerns, that he wasn't simply passing time. Because to Priscilla's parents, Elvis wasn't just the superstar the world adored. He was an adult man interested in their teenage daughter. And they had every reason to ask difficult questions. The relationship survived. But surviving was not the same as being easy. Years passed. Priscilla continued growing older. Elvis continued building his career. And the distance between them remained one of the central challenges. But something else was happening too. Priscilla was growing into the person she would eventually become. And Elvis was becoming increasingly comfortable with the idea that she could be part of his future. That was remarkable, because Elvis's world was changing constantly. His career was changing. His appearance was changing. His movies were changing. His public image was changing. But Priscilla remained connected to the part of his life that had begun in Germany. The girl he met there was no longer simply a memory. She was becoming someone he was actively trying to keep in his life. Then came the moment that changed everything again. Elvis and Priscilla's relationship continued to develop through visits and communication. And eventually, Elvis's plans became more serious. By the early 1960s, the possibility of Priscilla joining him in America was no longer just a fantasy. It was becoming a real possibility. But there was a condition. Her parents needed to agree. And that meant Elvis had to face one of the most important tests of the entire relationship. Not a concert, not a movie, not a performance, not a recording session. Trust. Could Elvis convince Priscilla's family that he was serious about her? Could he convince them that their daughter would be safe? Could he prove that what had started in Germany wasn't simply a temporary fascination? And could Priscilla's family accept that their daughter was about to enter the extraordinary world of Elvis Presley? These questions were no longer theoretical. They were about to become reality. Eventually, the family allowed Priscilla to move to Memphis. In 1963, she came to America to live with Elvis and his family at Graceland. Think about what that meant. Only a few years earlier, she had been sitting quietly in a room in Germany. Now she was entering the most famous private residence associated with Elvis Presley. Graceland, the gates, the mansion, the cars, the music, the employees, the celebrity visitors, the fans outside, the cameras, the endless attention. She was no longer looking at Elvis's world from the outside. She was stepping directly into it. And that was when Priscilla discovered something that would change her understanding of Elvis forever. Because knowing Elvis in Germany and living inside Elvis Presley's world were two completely different experiences. At Graceland, there was no escaping the reality of fame. Elvis couldn't simply walk outside like an ordinary man. People watched him. Fans waited for him. His schedule was unpredictable. His career demanded enormous amounts of time. His life was surrounded by people. And Priscilla was suddenly inside all of it. She had to learn how to live beside one of the most famous men on earth. She had to learn when the cameras were coming, when the fans were waiting, when Elvis needed privacy, when he needed silence, and perhaps most importantly, she had to learn the difference between loving Elvis and living with Elvis Presley. Those were not always the same thing. The man she had met in Germany was still there. But now she was seeing him under completely different circumstances. The pressure of fame, the demands of Hollywood, the expectations of the public, the constant attention. Everything was magnified. And Priscilla was growing up inside that world. Yet through all of it, the relationship continued. The girl from Germany had become part of Elvis's everyday life. And eventually, the question that had been waiting since the beginning became impossible to ignore. Would Elvis Presley marry Priscilla Beaulieu? They had survived Germany. They had survived an ocean. They had survived years of uncertainty. They had survived the enormous pressure of Elvis's fame. And now, they were approaching the moment that would turn their private relationship into one of the most famous marriages in entertainment history. But before the wedding, there was one more chapter, one more decision, one more moment when Elvis would have to choose whether the girl he met in Germany would become permanently connected to his life. Because years earlier, she had walked into a room as a 14-year-old girl. She had no idea what was waiting for her. She had no idea that the man sitting across from her would eventually become her husband. She had no idea that she would one day walk through the gates of Graceland as part of Elvis's inner world. And she certainly couldn't have imagined what would happen next. A wedding, a daughter, a family. But before any of that, Elvis had to make the decision. And when that decision finally came, the quiet conversation in Germany would no longer look like a coincidence. It would look like the first page of a story that had been unfolding for years. Because the girl Elvis met in 1959 was about to become Mrs. Elvis Presley. And the next chapter would begin with a question that millions of people would soon be asking. How did the king of rock and roll finally decide to marry the girl he met in Germany? Las Vegas, May 1, 1967. 7 years earlier, Elvis Presley had been a young soldier in Germany. He had been far from home, far from the stage, far from the life he once knew. And during one ordinary evening, he had met a 14-year-old girl named Priscilla Beaulieu. At the time, nobody could have imagined where that conversation would lead. But now, 7 years later, Priscilla was standing beside Elvis Presley. And this time they weren't simply talking. They were getting married. The king of rock and roll was about to marry the girl he had met in Germany. But behind the photographs, behind the headlines, behind the famous wedding, was a story that had taken years to reach this moment. A story about distance, patience, fame, growing up, and two people trying to hold on to a relationship while the entire world watched. The wedding took place at the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas. It was a small ceremony compared with the enormous spectacle people might have expected from Elvis Presley. But the meaning of the moment was enormous. Elvis and Priscilla had finally reached the point that seemed almost impossible back in 1959. Back then, they had been separated by an ocean. Now they were standing together as husband and wife. And for Elvis, the wedding marked something deeper than a headline. It meant that the relationship that had begun during his military service had survived. The teenager he met in Germany had become his wife. But their story was far from over. In fact, the wedding was only the beginning of another chapter. Because now came something neither fame nor money could prepare them for. Parenthood. Less than a year later, on February 1st, 1968, Priscilla gave birth to their daughter. Her name was Lisa Marie Presley. And suddenly, Elvis's life had changed again. The man who had once been known primarily for his music was now a father. The superstar had a family. The man who had once spent evenings in Germany talking quietly with a 14-year-old girl was now holding his own daughter. And for a moment, everything seemed to have come full circle. Think about that first night. A quiet room. A conversation. A girl who didn't know what the future held. A young Elvis who had no idea that the person sitting across from him would one day become the mother of his only child. Nobody could have predicted it. Not Elvis. Not Priscilla. Not their families. Not the people around them. And certainly not the millions of fans who only knew Elvis as a superstar. But life had taken that simple meeting and carried it somewhere neither of them could have imagined. For Priscilla, becoming a mother meant stepping into another role. She wasn't simply Elvis's wife anymore. She was Lisa Marie's mother. And Elvis wasn't simply the man whose records dominated the charts. He was a father. The private world they had built together now included a child. But there was something the public often failed to understand. Fame doesn't disappear when a celebrity walks through the front door. It follows them home. It follows them into their relationships. It follows them into their family. And living with Elvis Presley meant living with the extraordinary pressure surrounding Elvis Presley. The crowds, the fans, the photographers, the expectations, the constant attention. Priscilla had entered that world years earlier. Now she was raising a child inside it. Outside Graceland, fans continued gathering. Inside, life was different. There were quiet mornings, family moments, private conversations, and the ordinary routine that existed beneath the extraordinary public image. But Elvis's career continued to demand his attention. Hollywood continued calling. Music continued calling. The stage eventually called him back in a major way. And as the years passed, the contrast between the public Elvis and the private Elvis became increasingly important. Millions of people saw the performer. Priscilla saw the man at home. The difference could be enormous. On stage, Elvis could command an arena. At home, he was simply a husband and father. He could walk into a room and make thousands of people scream. But inside Graceland, the most important sounds could be much quieter. A conversation, a laugh, a child's voice, a family moment. Those were things the audience could never fully see. And perhaps that is why the story of Elvis and Priscilla remained so fascinating. It wasn't simply a love story between two famous people. It was a relationship that had begun before Priscilla was famous at all, before she was Mrs. Presley, before Graceland, before marriage, before Lisa Marie. It began when she was simply a teenage girl in Germany, and Elvis was simply a young soldier. That first meeting became the foundation of everything that followed. But the reality of marriage was far more complicated than a fairy tale. Elvis's career continued to grow. His schedule became demanding. His fame remained enormous. The pressures around him increased. And Priscilla was trying to build her own identity inside a world dominated by Elvis's name. They had entered marriage carrying the weight of everything that had happened before. And eventually, that weight would become impossible to ignore. By the early 1970s, cracks had begun appearing in the marriage. The relationship that had survived distance was now facing a different challenge. Not an ocean, not military service, not parents, not uncertainty about whether they would see each other again. Something much closer. The realities of adulthood, the pressures of fame, the changes in both of their lives, and the fact that people can love one another and still struggle to remain together. This is where the story becomes more complicated, because it would be easy to look at the wedding photographs and imagine that the story had a perfect ending. It didn't. The wedding was not the end. The birth of Lisa Marie was not the end. The years at Graceland were not the end. Their relationship continued changing. And eventually, Elvis and Priscilla separated. Their divorce was finalized in 1973. But even then, the story did not simply disappear. They remained connected through Lisa Marie. They continued to share a bond created by years of history. And the girl Elvis met in Germany would remain one of the most important people connected to his private life. There is something almost haunting about looking back at the beginning. Because when people hear the name Elvis Presley, they often imagine the enormous moments. The concerts, the jumpsuits, the screaming crowds, the movies, the records, the legendary performances. But one of the most important relationships in Elvis's life began without any of that. No stage, no microphone, no spotlight, no audience, just a room in Germany and a conversation. That is what makes the story so powerful. History often teaches us to look for enormous moments, but real lives don't always change that way. Sometimes the biggest turning points are almost invisible when they happen. You don't know you're standing at the beginning of something. You don't know that the person across from you will become part of your future. You don't know that a simple conversation will eventually lead to years of memories. You only realize it later. Much later. Imagine going back to that night in Germany. Imagine opening the door again. Imagine seeing Elvis sitting inside. He is 24. He has no idea what the next decade will bring. He doesn't know exactly how his career will change. He doesn't know what will happen to his marriage. He doesn't know how complicated fame will become. And he certainly doesn't know that the young girl sitting nearby will eventually become the mother of his daughter. Priscilla doesn't know either. She is 14. She is simply meeting Elvis Presley. Perhaps she's nervous. Perhaps she's curious. Perhaps she's trying to understand how the man from the magazines can seem so different in person. But neither of them knows that this night will become part of a story people will still discuss decades later. That's the mystery of life. You can stand inside a moment without knowing its importance. You can say something ordinary, and years later realize it was the beginning of something extraordinary. The first conversation between Elvis and Priscilla didn't change the world overnight. It didn't make headlines. It didn't stop traffic. It didn't produce an immediate transformation. But it changed their lives. One meeting led to another. One conversation became many. A friendship became a relationship. A relationship survived an ocean. That relationship eventually led to Graceland. Then marriage. Then a daughter. Then years of shared history. And even though the marriage eventually ended, the connection created that night never completely disappeared. Because Lisa Marie remained. Their memories remained. Their shared history remained. And the significance of that first meeting remained. There is also another side to the story. For Elvis, Germany was more than a place where he served in the army. It was a period of enormous transition. He had lost his mother. He had left the world of entertainment temporarily. He had entered military life. And somewhere during that period, he met Priscilla. The encounter became attached to one of the most transformative periods of his life. For Priscilla, Germany was where she first encountered the man who would become one of the defining figures of her life. Neither could have known it then. But sometimes people enter your life during periods of transition, and they remain connected to you long after the original circumstances disappear. And perhaps the most remarkable part is this. The world knew Elvis Presley. Millions knew the singer. Millions knew the movie star. Millions knew the king of rock and roll. But Priscilla knew a different Elvis. She knew the man away from the stage. The man who could sit and talk. The man who could be vulnerable. The man who could be private. The man who could be a husband. The man who could be a father. And that is something fame can never completely show. Because cameras capture moments. They don't capture entire lives. Years later, when people looked back at Elvis's life, they could point to hundreds of enormous moments. But somewhere among all those moments was a quiet night in Germany. A night that almost looked insignificant. A night without a concert. Without a headline. Without a major announcement. And yet, that night produced a relationship that would shape years of Elvis's private life. It produced a marriage. It produced a daughter. It created memories that neither Elvis nor Priscilla could simply erase. And it all began because two people sat down and talked. So imagine that room one final time. The year is 1959. Elvis is still a young soldier. Priscilla is still 14. Neither knows the future. Neither knows the distance that is coming. Neither knows about Graceland. Neither knows about Las Vegas. Neither knows about Lisa Marie. Neither knows about the challenges that will eventually test them. They only know what is happening right now. A conversation. A first impression. A moment. And somewhere in that ordinary evening, the future is already beginning. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly. Almost invisibly. Because the biggest stories in history don't always begin with explosions. Sometimes, they begin with a door opening. A young girl walking into a room. A famous man looking up. And one simple question. What is your name? Neither of them could have known where that conversation would lead. But years later, the answer was impossible to ignore. That girl became Priscilla Presley. She became Elvis's wife. She became the mother of his daughter. And she became one of the people who knew the man behind the legend. The king of rock and roll may have conquered stages around the world. but one of the most important chapters of his private life began in a much quieter place. Germany, 1959. One room, two people, one conversation, and a future neither of them could see coming.